In this section, we're going to start talking about setting up our scene. We've moved beyond the plate and beyond styling, and in the next section we'll talk about picking up the camera, but in between we need to make sure that everything around the plate is beautiful and well lit. So this section will have lots of great advice on how to get your lighting right and what elements to put in the background and what surfaces to take your pictures on, but none of that will be of any help if we take bad pictures of this good scene. It's very easy to look at your scene in a three-dimensional sense with the eye of a human, but as a photographer, you have to start looking at your picture through the camera lens, not through your eyes and through your mind that interprets things in a very different way. And that's why this lesson, before we start talking about the scene, is going to show you how to see like a camera instead of like a human. And we'll see how the two can be very, very different. Now, this is a frustrating problem that a lot of new photographers must go through at least a few times. You style your food beautifully, you set up a wonderful scene that's perfectly lit, and you take a bunch of pictures. And when you sit down to look at the pictures on your computer, you're discouraged and confused, wondering why they look so terrible. Why can you set up a good scene, style your food perfectly, do everything right, and yet you take bad pictures? The reason is because your eye and the camera lens see very different pictures. And your job as a photographer is to manage the gap between what the dynamic human eye and human mind see and what the camera lens sees, which is very simple and very honest. Let's go over some of the differences between your eye and the camera lens. You see in 3 dimensions. Your eyes send data back to your mind, which interprets the entire scene from every angle, and you get a very complete picture of the entire room. But the camera only sees a flat, 2-dimensional image. Similarly, you absorb the entire scene, everything in the room, you can look at it from different angles, and you understand the spatial elements of where you are. Whereas the camera just shows one small rectangle and leaves out the vast majority of the information going on in the rest of the room. You and your mind are also smart enough to fill in the gaps. If the scene is poorly lit, your mind still understands what's going on because it can look at it from different angles and gather more information than the small rectangle of the camera lens. But the camera is realistic and honest, and it only shows exactly what's in front of it. Your mind can adapt to changes. If you see the scene with good lighting and then the lighting changes, you can remember what it looked like before. But the camera lens is static and permanent. It takes one picture, that picture doesn't ever change, and it's going to show you exactly what's in the scene. Once we understand that our mind is very different than the camera lens, then we can start to see like a camera. We can design rectangular scenes because the camera only sees one small rectangular frame, so we can use that information to our advantage and set up a rectangular scene as opposed to the whole room. Unless you're taking a very wide shot, you're only going to have that small rectangular frame in focus, and that's the only thing you really need to pay attention to. So you can show only the elements that you want to be seen inside of that rectangle. Leave everything else out, put what you want in that rectangle, and it gives you a much more centralized focus to set up your shots. But none of this will make much sense until you practice. As always, these are just pointers that you can start to put into practice in your own shots. So the more you take pictures with the rectangle in mind, the better you'll get at it and the more this concept will make sense. Let's look at an example of the concept we've just discussed, but this time we'll look at it in reverse, because a good photographer will help you see the image like the camera rather than like a human. So here's what I mean. This picture is the apple cider. It's on a beautiful wooden table. There's fall leaves all around. We've got a dark background, and it's a beautiful scene, right? Well, actually, it's just sitting in my garage. As a human, this picture now looks very different, doesn't it? Your mind has a lot more information to interpret. It's got a much bigger rectangle to focus on, and that makes the scene look completely different, and it tells a very different story. But when we bring our rectangle back into focus, it suddenly makes sense again. What we could see as humans in the larger picture doesn't come into play when we only see the small rectangle. So when you're setting up the scene, Only focus on that small rectangle and leave everything else out. Learn how to make that one rectangle perfect and don't pay any attention to whatever is going on around the scene, and your pictures will start to look so much better. To help you illustrate this point for yourself, I'd love for you to cut out a rectangular frame from a piece of paper or poster board. Make it like a 3:4 ratio, about the size of a camera frame, and make sure there's plenty of paper around the edge as a border. So then when you set up your scene, or just walk around your house and look at different objects, look at it through this one single frame and leave everything else out of the picture. And that'll help you get in this mindset of understanding that you're only looking at the small frame. Second, set up a food photo shoot with this information in mind. Get your scene perfect through the rectangle as your camera will see it, and then snap a few pictures. I think you'll be surprised at how much the quality of the photo improves when you start designing for the camera and for the frame, which sees a very different picture than your eye and your mind.